a moment. It is okay. Let me see. Okay, it's nice. So thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure, great honor to
Thank you for having me.
you join us today. So today we will talk about Zhiyi. He was one of the greatest characters of Buddhism history and of the religious in general. And but before we talk about Zhiyi, who I'm reading here a text from Wikipedia, but it's a good text. And one of a researcher compared the importance of Zhiyi to the importance of Thomas Aquinas and Al-Ghazali in the West, because of he is one of the greatest systematizers of religious thought. I think it's interesting. But before we talk about Zhiyi, I would like to know about you, Jikai Dehn, who you are. And so please introduce yourself to us and tell us why you became interested in Zhiyi's thought.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great opportunity to give people a bit more information on Zhiyi and on the Tendai tradition more generally. My name, as you can see, is Jikai Dehn. I am originally from Australia, and I grew up in a fairly traditional Catholic family, but I was always keenly interested in Buddhism generally. And around the age of 14, 15, I went on exchange to Japan, and it was during that time, as part of my study of both Japanese and classical Chinese, that I began reading actual primary Buddhist texts, specifically the Sutra. And as I was reading through different sutra and trying to understand the particular positions of different schools, I had almost I guess you can say, an aha moment when I was reading through.
An eureka moment.
That's right. And that moment initially came when I was reading through the Lotus Sutra for the first time, which is an interesting text, and a lot of first-time readers to the text, and I think especially when it's read in European languages, because there are certain multivalences to both the Sanskrit and the Chinese versions that are lost in the English. So it can often seem as if the text is far simpler than it really is. In any case, my first eureka moment, as you say, occurred during my reading of the Lotus Sutra, and it was from there that I began specifically researching those schools that took the Lotus Sutra as central to their hermeneutic method. And so initially I looked into both the Tendai school and the various Nichiren-based movements. And as part of that, of course, I read some of the letters of Nichiren in Japanese. And of course, I began reading the works of Zhiyi. And it was while reading some of the works of Zhiyi, in particular for me, when I was reading for the first time the Fahua Wenzhu in Chinese, or Hokkien Mongu, which literally means the words and phrases of the Lotus Sutra. It was reading his passage-by-passage commentary to the Lotus Sutra that I again had another one of those eureka moments. And from that moment on, the rest, I guess, is history. At that point, during the remainder of my exchange in Japan, I officially became a Buddhist, and specifically a Tendai Buddhist. And after I left Japan, it was quite difficult to connect with Tendai Sangha. There weren't many around at the time, there still aren't. But during that period, I was given the contact details of the individual who became my master, and that was Ara Ryokan of the Hawaii Betsuin. He was the leading Tendai figure outside Japan at the time. He unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he was a very, very caring and very, very earnest, serious, strict teacher, which suited my personality well. His approach was very traditional, very text-based. He tended not to simplify things, and he tended to expect his Western students to follow the traditional method. He felt that whether or not we modified things for Western audiences later was a different question, but we had to receive the tradition in its entirety to ensure that nothing essential was lost. So during my university days, the beginning of my university days, so when I was about 18, he officially said to me essentially that it's quite unusual for someone to have grown up in a strict Christian background and to have, for various reasons, had a distinct interest in the Lotus Sutra, and specifically things like Zhiyi's writings. And not only that, but to have, during their high schooling years, have had the opportunity to study both Japanese and classical Chinese. So he essentially gave me a question, which has directed the rest of my Buddhist career, I guess you can say. He essentially suggested to me that those coincidences, those causes and conditions, let's say, were such that perhaps I had a moral imperative, a duty, to be more than simply a lay follower. And it was at that point that I realized, again, another kind of eureka moment. As soon as he had posed that question, I recalled the passage from the Lotus Sutra that specifically says, individuals who have the opportunity to hear these teachings are few. Of those who hear these teachings, those who have faith in these teachings, who trust these teachings, are fewer still. And of those who both hear and have faith in these teachings, those who practice these teachings are few indeed. And at that point, I decided to ordain. I was, of course, a struggling university student, so I saved the money that I could make in every way, and used that money to prepare for my ordination, pay for my tickets, and my initial home-leaving ordination, known as Shukke Tokudo, took place in Honolulu at the Hawaii Betsuin. And then after that ordination process began my formal training. So the formal ordination process in Tendai, unlike what we're more used to in Western traditions, the ordination itself happens at quite early on, once you've begun your basic training in Buddhism per se. You take ordination, and at that point you're officially a shami or a shramana, an acolyte, and then begins your formal ritual doctrinal education. So from that point on, every year I would spend a few months at the Hawaii Betsuin training, and then I think it was 4 or 5 years from that point, I did my intensive training in Japan on Mt Hiei, and that program is called Gyoin, and it is approximately 65 days at a minimum. It tends to vary. And during that time, essentially, the first half of that training is what we call the Engyo, or the Perfect Teaching section, and that is the component in which we learn what we inherited from the Chinese Tientai tradition specifically. So that is covering all of the rituals and meditative practices talked about in Zhiyi's works. But I would stress there that this particular program is not a seminary program in a doctrinal sense. It is more a practical, practice-based program. So the primary material is the ritual and meditative practices itself. And then the second month is what we call the Mikkyo section, and that's where we enter the esoteric practices that are unique to the Japanese form of Tendai. And after I finished my Gyoen program, I moved to Japan, and I spent the last 5 years there. I only moved back to Australia at the beginning of this year. So during that 5-year period, I assisted a number of temples, continued my doctrinal study, and assisted at the Tendai Buddhist High School in Tokyo. And that's me.
Very, very interesting. Welcome again. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm looking forward to hear about you talk about the Lotus Sutra and the influence of Zhiyi on Japanese Buddhism. But before, I want to know more. Could you give us an overview of his personal life? There is no need to give us details, but only an overview of Zhiyi's personal life.
Sure. So essentially, Zhiyi grew up during the 500s in China, during the Chen and Sui dynasties. As far as we know, his family was a minor Confucian official family. So we believe that his education was quite standard as far as the Confucian classics and the literati experience at the time. We know that his parents passed away during the turmoil of the fall of the Chen dynasty, but just prior to that event, it's suggested that somewhere around, I believe, the age of 7 or 8, depends on the source you use, but generally the records say 7 or 8. He is said to have heard the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra on Avalokiteshvara, or Kannon, Guanyin, and it was during that recitation that he had his eureka moment, if you like. And it was at that moment that he gained a particular interest in Buddhism, and the passing of his parents and the turmoil of the fall of the Chen dynasty clearly had an impact on the way in which he understood Buddhist teachings. Some people have suggested that is why the teacher that had the most influence on him was an individual named Huisi, or Eshi in Japanese. And the reason for that is that Huisi was central at that point in time in the idea of Mofa or Mappo, that is the age of the decline of the Dharma, the idea that the Dharma was the further we progress from Shakyamuni himself, the less sincere become practitioners and the less preserved are the teachings. In any case, Zhiyi, after the passing of his parents, became a monastic. He initially trained under a teacher who we're not entirely sure, but we believe was related to his eventual master Huisi. When I say related, I mean in a lineage sense, not familiarly. In any case, the fact that Zhiyi showed a particular penchant for the Lotus Sutra and also another work, the Dajra Dulun, that is reconstructed as the Mahapratnya Paramita Upadesha, which is, according to the East Asian tradition, a central work of Nagarjuna, but we don't have the Sanskrit work extant. So there are some questions about the authorship. In any case, it's clearly a very well-developed Madhyamakan work that builds off of the Abhidharmika system. So it appears to be a Madhyamaka reply to Abhidharma systems. And those two works were something that Huisi was intimately involved with because of the fact that Huisi himself was his master Hui Wen had been the leading authority on the Dajra Dulan at the time in Jingling, in the capital. So Zhiyi essentially joined Huisi at Mount Dasu, which, if one looks at a map of China, one will notice that Dasu appears essentially in the central area of China. And at the time, the northern and southern dynasties were distinctly separated, and a persecution of Buddhism had begun in the north. So a lot of masters were heading south. And it suggested that Mount Dasu was a particularly dangerous place on the frontiers of these two dynasties, kingdoms. So it's clear that Zhiyi was already a very sincere practitioner at a young age. It's said, of course, this is found in the hagiographies, but it's said that when Zhiyi arrived and met with Huisi, that Huisi remarked that he had met Zhiyi kalpas ago on Vulture Peak, and that the two of them had listened to the Lotus Sutra together, and that their karmic connections had brought them there again. And this is significant because there are two lineages that we inherit within the Tientai Tendai tradition. The first is premised on Zhiyi's practice on Mount Dasu with Huisi, and that is usually referred to as the lineage stemming from Zhiyi's Dasu awakening experience. That is the awakening experience he had on Mount Dasu. And then the second lineage we receive is the Vulture Peak lineage, the Lingshan lineage, and that is suggested to have been directly from Zhiyi and Huisi on Vulture Peak. And that lineage, those two lineages, I should say, fit quite well with the fact that the Zhiyi stressed from that point on this dual system, this balance between both doctrine and practice, or the two gates of Jiao and Guan. And it's the reason that works is because his practice on Mount Huisi is clearly cultivative, and therefore is representative of that practice element. And then, in some sense, it was very quickly acknowledged that it wasn't clear whether the idea of Zhiyi and Huisi hearing the Lotus Sutra directly on Vulture Peak was a literal event, or whether it was their awakening to the text of the Lotus Sutra. And therefore, that's clearly a doctrinal understanding, a textual understanding. So the two lineages are clearly represented there. After Zhiyi's two experiences, if you like, and his training on Mount Dasu, Huisi left Mount Dasu, and Zhiyi and the students that Huisi had left in Zhiyi's care essentially traveled for a time and eventually made their way to the capital, where Zhiyi gave a number of lectures. And it's at that time that Zhiyi became intimately related, or his movement, let's say, became intimately related with the Sui dynasty. In particular, Yang Guang, who would later become emperor. He was at the time the crown prince. Zhiyi spent a number of years in the capital, but he wasn't particularly happy with the way Buddhism was practiced within the court, let's say. And it's said, again, within the hagiographies, that each year there were fewer and fewer people who attended his lectures that understood his lectures. And it's at that time that Zhiyi makes one of his first retreats to Mount Tientai. We're not entirely sure why he picked the mountain, that particular mountain, but the mountain was certainly famous as a place for Taoist ascetics and other cultivators. So it's not entirely unusual. We just don't know specifically why he chose it. In any case, Zhiyi would be called back to the capital a number of times by the imperial court, and would refuse on some occasions, but on other occasions was not able to do so. It's during his time heading back to the capital on one of these requests that he actually passes away. So he passes away just off of the mountain itself, of Mount Tientai. And again, the hagiographies suggest that that fulfills a prophetic dream that Zhiyi had in his youth. So it's said that Zhiyi had a dream in his youth that he would end his days on a mountain overlooking the ocean. And of course, he was quite ill when he was last requested to head to the capital. And as per the prophecy, he couldn't leave the mountain. He passed before making it to the capital. But Zhiyi's life was not especially long by modern standards. He lived for about 60 or so years. We know that his lifestyle must have been a particularly hard one when he went to Mount Tientai. A number of the letters that the Crown Prince sends him suggest to us that there was not a lot of development in the region, that farming was and food supplies were clearly difficult to come by. Curiously, Zhiyi was, in some of his works, is hesitant to allow his community to farm and cultivate the area. He was concerned that might become an issue, another pursuit that would take them away from their practice. But they certainly did farm in a limited capacity there. During his life, just as an aside, the primary concern motivating Zhiyi was clearly to systematize what he had inherited from the Indian tradition, but also to resolve a particular dispute that was clearly occurring within Chinese Buddhism at the time. And it's often simplified as the northern and southern tendencies. And the idea is that essentially in northern China at the time, of course, the persecution that occurred there notwithstanding, it's suggested that practice-based traditions, which very likely were the formative movements for the later Chan or Zen tradition, were beginning to take shape. And in contradistinction to that, in the southern states, places like modern-day Guangzhou and the capital of Jingling, the intellectual traditions, at this time, there were still Indian monks that were coming via the sea routes, and that's probably why these movements were more popular in southern China. So there were still translation projects occurring, there were still Indian masters arriving, and essentially doctrinal issues were clearly, doctrinal systems and the study and explication of works were clearly the primary concern of a large number of the movements in the South. And so Zhiyi, we can see why Zhiyi's system then stressed things like these dual components of doctrine and practice.
Very interesting. Before I ask the next question, I want to a curious question. Have you ever been in Mount Tientai? Have you ever been there?
So I have been to China, but I have not made my way to Mount Tientai. It's certainly something that I had actually intended to go to Mount Tientai when I left Japan, but of course the current situation hasn't allowed travel of that sort. But I absolutely will once that opportunity becomes available.
Nice. Okay, I want to know more about his thought, and I know I don't know how many books he wrote, or I don't know, but I do know that there are two books, and people thought that they are the most important books of Zhiyi. I'm not sure, but the Treatise on Concentration and Insight and the Great Treatise on Concentration and Insight. So I want to know more about these two books, and also developing what you were saying. I know that here there are two principles that I'm very interested: the principles of samatha and vipassana, and they say that it's translated as Zi and Guan. And I'm not sure, but I think it's related to this question of theory and practice. And I think that in Buddhism, and also, of course, in Z's thought, there is no this separation or this chasm between theory and practice. So I put some things that you can develop in this answer. The books of Z, Treatise on Concentration, the Great Treatise on Concentration, and also this principle, samatha, vipassana, theory and practice. So you can develop in the way you want to answer.
Sure. So, as you rightly say, Zhiyi was a very prolific writer. He wrote a number of texts. Unfortunately, some are lost, but the vast majority we still have. The two texts that you mentioned, the treatise on calming and contemplation, sometimes called the lesser treatise or the short treatise on calming and contemplation, and then, of course, the great treatise on calming and contemplation. These two texts, in the Western academia, they have already been translated, of course, into English, and the lesser, the shorter treatise is also translated into French, and I believe there's a German translation as well. In any case, the great calming and contemplation treatise, the Moho-jigwan or Makashikan in Japanese, is particularly important. The shorter work was not especially important within the tradition itself. It was primarily a way of delineating a different type of shamatha and vipassana. So I won't go too far off because I don't want us to lose the train of thought. But as a general rule, Zhiyi suggested that shamatha and vipassana, and in this context, he's talking about both those two wings of meditative practice, but also about doctrine and practice. And I'll explain a bit how that works in a minute. But he essentially divides them into three different types. And he says that these three different types are the different types of shamatha and vipassana found within the Mahayana. So he makes that clear. The first type of shamatha and vipassana is the gradual and sequential, or jianzhi in Chinese. And this is, as the name suggests, a process where each of the techniques build very slowly on each other and gradually become more and more advanced as we go through. And I should caveat as well that is also doctrinal development. So you work very systematically in a gradual process. And the work that he used to describe that process, to describe that gradual shamatha and vipassana, was known as the Shichan Bolomi in Chinese, literally the explication of the dhyana paramita, or the perfection of dhyana, of meditative absorption. And that work is particularly large. It hasn't been translated into English yet. It's a very, very good work. And in fact, the shorter treatise on calming and contemplation that you mentioned is essentially a summation of that work. So it's a brief introduction, and the colophon to the shorter work suggests that it was written for a lay, educated but lay audience. So in any case, that work was based on that gradual form of shamatha and vipassana. The second form of shamatha and vipassana that he delineates, he essentially calls the buding, or the unfixed. In other words, it isn't a gradual progression from simplest to easiest in practice and doctrine, but a corrective method. In other words, it takes at times more advanced methods and doctrines, and at times easier ones, and it applies them dependent on the audience in question. And the work that he used to describe this type of Shimata and Vipassana is called the Liu Miao Famen, or the six. So the current English translation translates this as something like the six sublime Dharma gates, which is a literal translation of the title. It's a bit hard in English because it's not the six Dharma gates themselves that are sublime. It's more a case of there are six gates to the sublime Dharma, and the word sublime there is the miao in the title of the Lotus Sutra, the myo in Myo Horengekyo. So there's a connection there as well. In any case, that work is also quite short, and that again is representative of a different type of Shimata and Vipassana, and also of doctrinal development. And then the final type is what he called the yuendun, or the endon in Japanese, literally the perfect and sudden. And essentially, this is the type of Zhiguan, or Shimata and Vipassana, that Zhiyi first of all practiced himself, and is the version that is practiced within the Tientai tradition. And that's the text, that's the type discussed in the text that you mentioned, the great calming and contemplation. When we're talking about the technical details, one finds that the differences between the gradual and the perfect and sudden are not quite what one would expect. The case is a little bit more of refining on what is already described in the gradual. Unfortunately, over time, some of that attention to some of those details displayed in the gradual was de-emphasized at different periods of time in the tradition. But as a general rule, each of those texts is studied, but the Moha Zhiguan, the Great Calming and Contemplation, is clearly the central text as far as those three types of Shimata and Vipassana is concerned. The other two, the other two primary works of Zhiyi are known as the Fahua Suanyi, or the Hokke Gengi, literally the profound meaning of the Lotus Sutra. And it's actually that work that Nichiren uses as his primary influence. Essentially, that work uses two things. It uses the title of the Lotus Sutra, which of course you can clearly see in the emphasis that Nichiren, for example, placed on the chanting of the title of the Daimoku. Zhiyi's emphasis is a little bit different. He uses the title and a schema known as the 5 types of sublime meaning, or profound meaning, I should say. And in that work, his attempt essentially is to use the characters of the title to suggest that titles of works are representative of key concepts within the works, and therefore that if one is properly trained and properly understanding of the text in question, then one can use those characters and those titles as mnemonic devices capable of being employed to explicate a doctrine at length. And then the final of his 3 major works is the Fahua Wenju, or the Hokke Mongu, which I referred to initially. That is a commentary in the type that in the West we're more familiar with, passages and words from the text being explicated. The way in which this connects to this 2-winged system of doctrine and practice. First of all, let's take these 2 wings of Shimata and Vipassana. So initially speaking, Shimata and Vipassana are the 2 basic categories into which various meditative techniques are delineated, separated. Shamatha as a catch-all, now there are specific types of shamatha, but as a catch-all, shamatha is those types of meditation that promote concentrative cultivation. So to use a few buzzwords, things like single-mindedness or concentration of thought, those kinds of things. Whereas vipassana are those types of meditative practices that are contemplative reflections. In other words, you have particular doctrine or particular issues, what we call downfalls, that are used as the basis for contemplative exercise. Now, very quickly, those two types of meditation can't properly be distinguished from each other in an absolute sense, because one cannot contemplate properly without clearly refined concentrative apparatus. At the same time, concentrative apparatus is fairly useless without something to concentrate on. Concentration is always concentration of something, right? Concentration on something. So from the very beginning, that division, as far as meditative practice is concerned, was clearly not an absolute one. The two implied each other and fed into each other. And Zhiyi essentially extends that system in some sense. What Zhiyi does is says, doctrine is clearly the same. I can use various sets of terms. In this case, Zhiyi suggested I can use shamatha and vipassana to refer to two types of meditative concentration, and therefore I can describe all of the basic practices that a Buddhist must do. But I can also use those same two terms, shamatha and vipassana, to describe different types of doctrinal developments. And the reason he can do this is because shamatha and vipassana, both in the Sanskrit, but very clearly in the Chinese, because the Chinese terms for those, zhi and guan, literally mean stopping or cessation, and contemplation, or if we press contemplation, even observing. And so clearly, not just practice, but doctrine can be divided into those two things. On the one hand, you have doctrine and sutra and commentarial texts that are clearly designed to stop or put a stop to those unskillful habits, thoughts, practices. And then there are other doctrines that are clearly constructive. That is, they give you something that is supposed to be developed and understood, and that would be your actual wisdom or prajna. So on the one hand, you have those things that are corrective to avidya, that is ignorance, and then those other methods that are clearly constructive, and that is the development of prajna or prajna, depending on which Sanskrit pronunciation from parts of India. But in any case, Zhiyi uses those two binomes, that is shamatha vipassana, zhi and guan, to describe both of his systems. And when he's using that interchangeably with doctrine and practice, the zhi, the cessation, the stopping, is what he uses to imply practice, and then the guan, the contemplative side, is clearly more cerebral, and therefore references his doctrinal developments. And in fact, this a lot of the English literature suggests that this is something that Zhiyi kind of develops on his own. And it's certainly clear that Zhiyi emphasizes this in a way that was more forcefully made, or the case was more forcefully made in his works. But what a lot of people miss is that Zhiyi is clearly working from the Abhidharma systems. He's clearly paying attention to what were considered the best of the received traditions. And it's a little bit unclear which Abhidharma sources he was using, We're not entirely sure. Sometimes we can trace it, but in any case, it's clear that he has a very well-developed sense of those traditions. And this particular emphasis on practice and doctrine can be understood as his attempt to re-emphasize a particular division made in that tradition. And that is the Abhidharma tradition makes a division between what it calls darshana and bhavana. And darshana is view, and that is clearly more readily, I'm generalizing here a little bit, but it's clearly more readily understandable as intellectual, cerebral understanding. And then bhavana is cultivation. And these two are emphasized in that tradition, again, not something they've made up, because one of the epithets of the Buddha is that he is perfected in both wisdom and cultivation, in Chinese Ming Xing Zu. And again, unfortunately, this concept is very, very clear in both the Sanskrit and the Chinese versions of the Lotus Sutra that we have. Is clearly emphasized this division. I say unfortunately, I mean in the sense that as far as I have seen, the majority of English translations don't make this particularly clear. It's sometimes a choice of terminology. In other cases, it's simply a case of taking some of the terminology in a literal way that misses what the tradition would have understood terms to mean. And so an example of that is one of the epithets of the Buddha specifically is that he is, in English, it's often translated as honored among bipeds. And it sounds a little bit strange, but there's a dual meaning going on here, because the word for that's being translated here as ped from the Latin for foot or leg, right, is literally in the Chinese, and it works the same in Sanskrit, by the way. In the Chinese is clearer, though, I must admit, but the word is zu, and that can be a shortening of the word ju zu, which literally means completion or accomplishment, or the completion of something. And so if I understand that word that's been translated as leg here as accomplishment, then instead of two legs, we have two accomplishments. And it's clear that the commentarial literature understands this to be referential of these two things, of darshana and bhavana, this wisdom and cultivation being perfected. So it's clearly a pattern that Zhiyi hasn't developed himself. He's clearly drawing from the traditions. It's simply that he comes at a time where perhaps the tendency in both the North and South had become pronounced in different ways, and he was trying to reassert that balance, which is rather ironic considering the way in which, of course, later in Japan, the single practice schools of the Kamakura essentially come out of this movement, and essentially, it may not be entirely accurate, but in very general terms, reproduce some of the tendencies that Zhiyi was clearly responding to.
Thank you. Very, very important. I want to. I'm thinking. I don't know if I'm right, but thinking in my Western life, and because here in the West we have a lot of separations, a lot of divisions. For instance, the division between body and mind, the division between practice and theory, and so on. Do you think we can have a more integrated life if we understand what all that you just answered, all these principles?
Yeah, I think your point is a good one. I think that certainly in the Western tradition, we have this division clearly in our intellectual thought, and certainly, I mean, there are philosophers and so forth who've tried to come up with varying solutions to that. I think you're right, and I think what makes, in particular, systems like Zhiyi's system very useful in this regard at reassessing this division and perhaps reintroducing a balance that is clearly necessary there, is that while Zhiyi emphasizes this division, what makes it not a genuine division and not an absolute division is the fact that he specifically chose as his fulcrum, as the crux of his system, a text which strikes people as particularly unusual, and that is the Lotus Sutra. And the reason I say that is that Zhiyi was not the first person to try and come up with a holistically systematic system like this. It was something that Buddhists had tried to do for a long, long time. What I think, of course, take this with a grain of salt because I am from the tradition, so I inevitably feel this way, bear that in mind. But I think what makes Zhiyi's attempt rather unique is that the text he chose as the basis, the crux, the fulcrum for this attempt is a text that usually strikes most readers as not particularly philosophically rigorous. It is a text. Now, I don't think that that's true because I've spent a lot of time studying it, but as a general text, it is not as philosophically taxing in its initial read as texts, for example, like the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Garland Sutra, or the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom class of sutras. These texts clearly deal with concepts like emptiness, concepts like interpervasion, and those kinds of things in a very robust way. Both of those sets of texts were used by different traditions as the crux, the fulcrum around which these attempts were made. But in some sense, the fact that one of the key insights of the Lotus Sutra, for example, is that its key doctrine, if you like, is the idea of recontextualization. In other words, the Lotus Sutra it takes as its essence the doctrines that have already been preached in other sutras. And what it does is it begs the question, if I put those clear, common, already accepted assumptions into a particular context, how does that change the way you understood that concept? And in short, what that means is that the Lotus Sutra is a text that is a teaching about how one should regard teachings. And that allows it to be a de-centered center. It's a center that does not precisely, in many ways, firmly come down in X, Y, or Z manner. What that means is that when Zhiyi has that as the center of his system, he can then say, what context can I put around such divisions? Divisions of doctrine and practice, mind and body, nirvana, samsara, that brings out more of those concepts that was not perhaps visible before. And I think that to answer your question specifically, I think that provides us with a very, very good model for coming up with a more integrated understanding of these kinds of divisions, because it allows me to see other positions in a debate like that as not just alternative positions, but as necessary positions. In other words, this is a silly example, but to keep things simple, if Zhiyi's and the Lotus Sutra's contextualizing concept is our center, we have something in English. I'll use a simple example, but Dr. Brooks Zaporan uses an example often in his works. He suggests that it's, and I think it's a good, an apt example. He suggests that it's a little bit like a melody and the notes in a song. And this contextualizing situation is a little bit like the melody itself. The melody is some quality about each of those notes, but in each of those notes distinctly analyzed in the moment each of those notes are played, there is no melody. I mean, they're just grating singular sounds. So if I played all of those notes at once, there would be no melody. If I just listened to each of them separately, there is no melody. But it's this ability to take those as developmental is not quite right, but as necessary components of the melody. And of course, the Lotus Sutra uses that specifically when it recontextualizes what everyone thinks they know about what are called the three vehicles, the Shravakas, the Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. And generally speaking, it very radically recontextualizes those, and by very simple statements. It says, I only teach bodhisattvas. Anyone hearing me say that, therefore, is ipso facto a bodhisattva. But it plays out in very important ways. It shows in a number of the parables, for example, the parable of the magic city, in which the only reason they reach the final goal is because they were not aiming for the final goal. They were aiming for the magic city. And in other words, precisely by not being the understanding that we want you to get, in this case, the ultimate truth with a capital U and a capital T, that is precisely how they got there. And the same applies to the parable of the burning house. The children don't get out of the house because they want to be free of the fire and the danger and so forth. They get out of the house precisely because they were pursuing the carts that they wanted. And I think that is where texts like the Lotus Sutra as a center for a system are really crucial, because they're flexible enough. I mean, the idea of contextualization is not something that rigidly restricts a system of thinking. It's something that allows a system to develop and shift in important ways. And I think that's what's kept the tradition rather dynamic in the right ways. So certainly I think you're right. I think there needs to be a more holistic understanding of these kinds of dual concepts that pervade our usual ways of thinking. And I want to, but I'll just before I end there on that point, I'd like to say that this is often misunderstood. Zhiyi is not, he's not trying to give a very vague, wishy-washy kind of everything is all one kind of idea. This is a very robust way of looking at these things, and it has to be understood that the duality and this contextualizing, overarching decentering that occurs are both maintained at the same time. The two don't work without the other. If I remove those clearly commonsensical divisions, this decentered middle that Zhiyi refers to is not intelligible. It doesn't work. So I just want to make that clear. Often people understand that as being a very kind of vague, everything kind of just blends into a overarching suchness. Zhiyi would be very upset with that kind of thing.
Very, very interesting. And the metaphor you made about the melody and the notes, I really liked it. I have two more questions, but I don't know how many time you have, but I will.
I'm very free at the moment, so no problems on time.
Yeah, I want to know more about the Lotus Sutra, if you could develop it, but I want to know also the influence of Zhiyi on Japanese Buddhism, mainly on Nichiren. So if you can talk
Sure.
about.
Sure. I'll start with the very obvious ones that people know, so that we can then get into some slightly deeper things about the Lotus Sutra. generally speaking, when people give simple explanations of what makes the Lotus Sutra particularly unique, they usually give examples such as all beings will attain Buddhahood. They give examples of the ekayana, the single vehicle. They explain that the Buddha does not pass away in the way that he is usually described in earlier texts. And they emphasize the duty of practitioners to walk the bodhisattva path, and in particular to uphold what is called the myoho, or the sadharma, the miaofa, the true or the sublime dharma, depending on which form you use of that. These are all true. These are all very, very true. But none of those things that I just mentioned, if I'm being perfectly honest, and I say this as someone who genuinely, as a practitioner, believes that the Lotus Sutra is an important, not just important, the text for Buddhist knowledge. But all of those qualities that I just mentioned are not unique to the Lotus Sutra. Unfortunately, a lot of people who have a summary understanding of Buddhism assume that they are. And certainly the case is made in the Lotus Sutra for those points in a very clear, emphatic way, perhaps more emphatic than in other places. But the concept of the ekayana does appear in other texts. That is the idea of one vehicle. The concept of the sadharma, the true dharma, does appear in other texts. What makes the Lotus Sutra specifically unique is a couple of interrelated points. I touched on it briefly when I said there's this concept of recontextualization. But that occurs in a number of really crucial ways. As a general rule, practitioners were understood to be of particular sorts. The Sanskrit term for this is often gotra, or sometimes that usually means a clan or group, but it tends to refer to a type in the way we would understand it. Of course, that becomes the doctrine of the three vehicles, and that is the Shravakayana, the Pratyeka Buddhayana, and the Bodhisattvayana. Now, the reason that's crucial is that even standard Mahayana texts describe the process of someone becoming a Shravaka, for example, as a dangerous process as far as the Mahayana is concerned. Because when someone becomes or cultivates the Shravaka Yana, Shravaka Marga, the path of the Shravaka, the idea is that they will become an Arhat, an Arhatpa. And the problem with that is that by the early understanding of that concept, one achieves extinction. They achieve literal extinction. And if someone becomes extinct because they have no longer the downfalls, the klesha, the various forms of ignorance, to simplify a little bit, that doesn't mean that they have pratnya, that they have amala pratnya, clear wisdom, pure wisdom per se. They are not Buddhas. They do not understand necessarily the Dharma in its deep essence, and therefore are not capable of teaching other bodhisattvas, for example. That means that someone who gains arhatship, becomes an arhat, loses the chance to ever become a Buddha. And so a lot of Mahayana texts talk about that as a very serious danger. And in fact, that's part of the initial Mahayana critique of what it refers to, of course, traditionally as the Hinayana. In any case, the Lotus Sutra is recontextualizing of that concept and saying, no, I only teach bodhisattvas. Therefore, there is only one ekayana. There is one vehicle. There is only one type. And it specifically refers to that ekayana also as a buddhayana, to distinguish it. And a lot of people miss this because the text uses the word Buddhayana and Bodhisattvayana interchangeably. And the reason it's doing that is because it's trying to, sometimes when it's referring to Bodhisattvayana, it's referring to the pre-Lotus Sutra Mahayana. That is, that some people are bodhisattvas, but others are not. They can become bodhisattvas, but they may not be training to be bodhisattvas. And then in other contexts, it's saying, but that was never the case. And therefore, the Bodhisattvayana is always the Buddhayana. So sometimes that level of recontextualization can be lost in some passages if you're not paying close attention to what's going on there. This recontextualization again appears, and you can see this in the way the Lotus Sutra opens and closes. These are very simple things, again, that don't appear to be particularly doctrinally rigorous, but they're very, very difficult to unpack notions the closer you read them. In the opening chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha is in samadhi. It's known as the Ananta Nirdesha Pratisthana. Literally, so the Chinese translates this as the infinite meanings samadhi, or the abode of infinite meanings. And that, of course, is in the East Asian tradition understood to be explained in the opening sutra of the infinite meanings. But in any case, in the first chapter, the Buddha is in this samadhi, and a number of particularly unusual events occur. The Buddha's a ray of light is emitted that specifically illuminates all of the activities that occur in all of the realms, from the hells up to the Bhavagra, that is the summit of existence. And a number of the bodhisattvas in the assembly are particularly confused by this course of events. What's curious about this is that the lead figure in this confusion is the Bodhisattva Maitreya. Now, to anyone familiar with the Mahayana literature, and not just the Mahayana literature, but those who would have been referred to as Hinayana pejoratively, the only bodhisattva that all of them would have accepted would have been Maitreya. Both pre-Lotus Sutra Mahayana and what is the Shravakayana would have accepted Maitreya as the future Buddha, the next Buddha. In other words, somebody who should be second only to Shakyamuni himself. And yet, we have a passage in which that individual has no idea what is going on. And that individual then has to ask Manjushri Bodhisattva, of course, who the symbolism there is not lost, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. He asks Manjushri Bodhisattva to help explain what's going on. He says, surely you've experienced this before. What is going on? And Manjushri clearly explains that in the distant past, there was a Buddha named Sun Moonlight Brightness, is the English translation. And again, there's symbolism here that is lost when one isn't clear on the meanings that are going on here. In that tradition that accepts both of those, in both traditions, the Shravakayana and in the Mahayana, Shakyamuni is referred to as the son of wisdom, and Maitreya is referred to as the merciful moon, the sun and the moon. And then we have this bodhisattva who appears in the distant past before anyone can remember, except for Manjushri Bodhisattva, whose name symbolizes the two central figures to the tradition. And he says at that time, that particular Buddha was part of a continual process of Buddhas with the same name, who also entered this samadhi, and this samadhi was indicative of the fact that they would then preach the Lotus Sutra, the Sadharma, the true Dharma without any skillful means. And therefore, I deduce that that is what will happen. And so once again, we have a recontextualizing. The two figures that are supposed to be central, Maitreya and Shakyamuni, are recontextualized into a past that far extends before the the 7 Buddhas that usually were explained and expressed, is something that Maitreya himself is not aware of. And then this is mirrored again in chapters 22 and 23. 22 and 23 actually mirror, I should say, 21, 22, and 23, but 22 and 23 mirror chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra. They mirror chapter 1 in this event because there is another Buddha described with a very similar name that expresses this process. But in chapter 22, the Buddha has given us the commission to uphold this sadharma now. And he uses a phrase, and this leads into your next question about the influence on Japanese Buddhism, because this relates to a little bit of a distinction between the way in which the Orthodox Tientai Tendai tradition understands certain passages and the way in which Nichiren interpreted certain things. There is a passage in chapter 21, I believe it is, which essentially runs as follows. I'm paraphrasing from memory here, but it essentially, the Buddha gives us, the listeners of the sutra, he says, I will pass away. But of course, we already now know that that's not absolute passing away. We understand that in a different way now. But he says, once I am gone, I entrust it to you, the members of this assembly. And there are 2 chapters there because he gives 2 different types of entrustment of the doctrine. But in any case, he entrusts it to us. And then he says in the verse section there, just like the sun and the moon are capable of destroying the darkness in the world, these individuals, that is, those individuals who uphold this sadharma, this myoho, this sublime dharma, are capable of destroying literally the dimness in sentient beings. Now, for anyone familiar with those images, the sun refers to Shakyamuni in the past. It passed in the sense that he will pass, right? He will not be actively present. He will pass in a provisional sense into nirvana. And the moon, as we said, refers to Maitreya, who will come but has not yet come. In the interim, those who uphold the Buddha's essence as sadharma, as the true dharma, are those who, just like he and Maitreya, will be able to eliminate the darkness. Now, that passage is used within the Tientai tradition to refer specifically to the duty of those disciples who uphold the Lotus Sutra. So it's a general statement referring to those of us who take this commission seriously. In the Nichiren tradition, in fact, that passage is part of where Nichiren's name, the Nichi means sun. And Nichiren understood himself essentially as, based on passages in chapter 21, as the individual. And this is in part because of the way the Chinese can be read. Chinese is a non-inflected language. And so Chinese finds it very difficult in some instances to distinguish between plurals, between something that's supposed to be a noun and a verb, even in certain cases. They're often interchangeable. And in these passages, it uses the term 四人, and 人 means person or individual, and 四 is I'm being very simple here, but it's literally like a pointer. So it's something like in English, this, that, these, those, depending on the context. You have to use the context to understand which one is appropriate. And so, of course, in Nichiren's reading, it referred to this person, singular. And Nichiren understood himself in a certain capacity to be prophesied in some of those remarks. Now, the Orthodox tradition doesn't necessarily agree with that. That is a difference in interpretation. Depends on which Nichiren tradition you go with, by the way. The Nichiren Shu, for example, suggests that Nichiren saw himself as an embodiment of one of the bodhisattvas of the earth. So there are 4 bodhisattvas of the earth that emerge. And again, that's part of a recontextualization. All of the current assembly say to the Buddha, we will uphold your dharma once you're gone. And Shakyamuni recontextualizes things by myriad bodhisattvas led by 4 individuals emerging from the earth. And the numbers are infinite. And all of the members of the assembly, of course, are confused yet again by this recontextualization. What's happening here? We've been with you for the 40 years that you have been a Buddha. How could you have trained all of these infinite numbers of people that we've never met before? So again, we have this shift, this recontextualizing. How does that change what you think you know about these basic assumptions about Dharma? In any case, the Nichiren Shu tradition understands Nichiren to have been the Bodhisattva superior practice, which is one of the leaders of those groups, the 4 that emerge. Other traditions, such as the Nichiren Shoshu and its connected lineages, primarily from the Fuji Fusei sublineage. So I'm thinking of Nichiren Shoshu and the Soka Gakkai, Nichiren Kensho Kai, and some of those newer movements. Their understanding is that Nichiren is in fact the true Buddha, specifically the Buddha described in chapter 16 as the Kuon Jitsujo, that is the enlightened in the infinite past, sometimes referred to as the Hombutsu, or the original Buddha, but there's problems with that term. Their basis for this is somewhat confusing, but that's another point. In any case, it is clear from Nichiren's writings that he felt that a large number of the passages here were prophetic in a strict sense. In other words, they must be prophecies about specific individuals or specific events that would happen. The Tientai Tendai tradition doesn't treat them as specific prophecies. They tend to be very general or broader prophecies. The other distinction there that becomes very clear is that because the Tientai Tendai tradition understands the core of the Lotus Sutra, in essence, to be what I'm describing here is this recontextualizing modus that is in use. Zhiyi specifically, he uses a number of terms, but the most common he uses is kai chun xianshi, literally to open the provisional and reveal the real. In other words, the Lotus Sutra is like a key, a recontextualizing key that opens what was true within all that which is provisional. Because that is how we approach the Lotus Sutra, that is really a core difference between the Tientai Tendai tradition and the Nichiren traditions. Now, perhaps certain Western Nichiren practitioners would disagree with me there. And I say that because, you know, I want to be fair in my representation there. However, the Western reading of Nichiren tends to include a great deal of the Tientai tradition, which within Japan is not as centrally core. So, for example, this idea that the Lotus Sutra is this key, this recontextualizing organ, is central to the Tientai Tendai tradition, and probably a number of people in the Nichiren Western communities would probably agree that they feel that that's a key component of the Lotus Sutra. And in some parts of Nichiren's writing, it's clear that Nichiren takes that to be true in certain ways. But one way, for example, where that is clearly distinct is that the Tientai Tendai tradition clearly sees then that if one understands this recontextualizing apparatus as what it means to be sadharma, true dharma, then anything else can be recontextualized once you understand that sadharma. And therefore, the Tientai Tendai tradition, at least the orthodox movement, there have been some masters who've argued differently over time, but the orthodox movement has understood the Lotus Sutra in an inclusive sense. In other words, the entirety of the Buddhist tradition can be utilized, not just utilized, but that they become the sadharma when understood through the lens of the Lotus Sutra. And that's really crucial, because Nichiren was clearly of the more exclusivistic understanding of the Lotus Sutra. And it's clear, for example, that Nichiren suggests that in Mappo, in this decline of the Dharma age in particular, that it might be beneficial to practice things like Shimata and Vipassana meditation, Shikan or Zhiguan, or to intone, for example, the Nembutsu, to accumulate merit via the recitation of names of Buddhas, or mindfulness of Buddhas, depending on the context. But that the fact that the Lotus Sutra itself was the Sadharma meant that it was supremely valuable in a distinct way. So there is a distinction being made there. There is a change or a shift occurring there, even though certain Nichiren practitioners might disagree about precisely where that shift comes in. But there is a distinct shift there. That is clear. So I'll use that as the segue into the traditions in Japan, perhaps. I hope you're okay for time. If there's any issue, please let me know.
Oh, I really enjoyed what you said. I understood more clearly the Lotus Sutra. I read the Lotus Sutra in English, of course, but all these few things you said about the Lotus Sutra made me understand it. It was very beautiful and profound. Very, very beautiful. Just to finish, I will make an invitation. Maybe there's no, I'm not hurry, but we can make another video about the Lotus Sutra, but some months later when you have time. Okay, there's no,
sure.
So I don't know. That's my invitation.
I would be happy to do that.
Oh, thank you. So I will. Okay, later I will send an email to you and explain more. And there is no need to make it. We can make it next year if you don't have time. There's no hurry. But I really want to listen you talking about the Lotus Sutra, because I really enjoyed what you said. It's very, very beautiful and profound. And
I'm glad I could be helpful.
Thank you very much. It was a great video. One of the interviews that I made that I most enjoyed. So it was very, very important interview. Thank you very much. And I will give some time to say what more you want to say. If you want to, I don't know, share about, talk about your channel on YouTube or your Facebook page, whatever you want to talk about.
Sure. So I can be found, if anyone is interested, I can be found on Facebook at Jikai Tyler Dehn. If you look me up, I'm sure you'll see the bald head on my profile picture, so I should be easily findable. I also have a YouTube channel. There aren't too many videos yet, but I hope to post some more soon. And that can again be found at Reverend Jikai Dehn, so Rev, R-E-V, Jikai Dehn. We do have a website, the tendaiaustralia.com.au. However, at present we're redoing the website, so if you have any problems with it, check again later. So I am freely available. I have, as I mentioned earlier on, I have moved back to Sydney, Australia at the beginning of this year. So I am trying to re-establish a clear formal community here. I hold regular classes, both on things like the Lotus Sutra and Tientai practice, but also when current circumstances allow, we do meet, of course, socially distanced for meditative practice and services. So anyone who would like to contact me is welcome to do so at jikai.tendaiau@gmail.com. And so I can be reached there for any purpose. And I hope anyone who has an interest in either the Lotus Sutra generally or Tendai Buddhism more specifically will get in touch, and I'm more than happy to help where I can.
So thank you very much. I will close the recording.